Hello there, this is Yanis from Arcweave, and this is our basic tutorial series. If you're new to Arcweave, we advise you to start watching from the beginning of this series so that everything makes more sense. In this video, we will discuss Arcweave's important function called visits. So far, to track whether the player has visited parts of the story, that is, if they have performed specific actions or have received specific pieces of information, we have been using global variables. See episode 10 of this tutorial series. The downside of this is, of course, that the global variables list quickly gets out of control. You get tons of variables, one for every story or dialogue case that needs to be checked later on, and this causes a major clutter. To solve this issue, we implemented visits, a function that checks how many times the player has visited a specific element. So let's see this in action. If we go to our project in a tavern on the Druid branch, the one labeled Ask Voxel, we can add a check to see whether the player has first asked the Necromancer, Solon Blasphemius. We can add this check in the second to last element. So here. So if we double-click inside this element to edit it, we hit return, and then we add an ArcScript segment here. And just to remind everyone, we can either click on this icon that says ArcScript segment, or do the shortcut, the shortcut which is Control Shift and C, or Command Shift and C for a Mac. And this is where we'll be calling the visits function. Now the question is, which element represents the action of asking the Necromancer? We can actually choose this one, since after we select the option Ask Solon Blasphemius, this one is the first one to come up. In order to pass an element as an argument for the visits function, we have to make sure the element has a title. So let's give this element a title, and we can call it Asking Necromancer. All right. Now if we go back to our ArcScript segment, the one we started here, and type visits, if visits, and open parentheses, then we can type the @ character, just as we do with mentioning a component or a board. And now we get a pop-up list of various elements that we can choose to place as argument for our visits function. And the one we want is, of course, Asking Necromancer. Of course, we can start typing ask in order to narrow down this list, and we get this one, Asking Necromancer, and then we have to close the parentheses. So to close this conditional statement, we can just type if visits of the element Asking Necromancer is greater than 0, which means basically if we have visited the Asking Necromancer element at all, we can add story-wise the druid. We can add some extra line by the druid. And then we have to close the if block with an end if statement. And this is it. So to go through that again, I see, you sigh. Now, if the visits of the element Asking Necromancer are more than 0, so basically if we have visited that element, we have a little space here, so we get a line break, and then the druid says, at least I had something in my pockets. Right. Before we play this out on play mode, let's also call visits from inside a branch. So from the same element, we connect a branch and we add the condition if visits, the same condition actually, if visits at asking necromancer is greater than 0, and then we can divert to an element where we can give the poor druid a pat on the back for having something in his pockets. So we connect, and then we connect to another element where I'll just copy this one, delete everything. There. And then I can just type, you give Voxel a pat on the back. And then I will connect back to the end with, well, repeating the label, oh well. So now, what basically happens here is that in this element, this part appears only if we have already visited the necromancer, the asking necromancer element. And if we've done so, this also option appears, which we have to give it a label, or just put it here saying, give him a pat on the back. So therefore, if we get, if we have visited the asking necromancer element, we get the option to choose oh well, or give him a pat on the back, and then we can end this amazing adventure. Let's test this on play mode. So we hit play. So now, if we quickly go first to the druid, of course I do. Well, how much have you got? I need to change this so it's on the second person, but anyway, let's do that right after. So Voxel empties his pockets, all these things. I got 3, yes, they were right here, I see. And oh well. So since we haven't visited the necromancer part, we don't have the other option and we don't have the extra text. Now, if I restart, so just a sec, let's first ask the necromancer, and how about the, so anyone else? I do, says Voxel. Well, how much have you got? I got all these, I see. And then we get the extra line that says, at least I had something in my pockets. And then we get the extra option, give him a pat on the back. And then we can do the oh well part. Right. So as we have already mentioned, the function returns the number of visits, which is an integer. Very often, though, we don't care about counting the visits, we only care about whether we have or haven't visited an element at all. Like here, we don't actually... Oops. There you go. We don't actually care about how many visits we have paid to the necromancer element. We only care about whether we have or haven't paid any visit to the necromancer element. So this we can simplify in this case the syntax and consider 0 visits as being false and any other number of visits as true. So if I simply delete this part, this is still valid, and if we get any visits to the necromancer element, we can still get the option to give him a pat on the back. This is a way to simplify this syntax, since it's very common only to care about whether you've seen something or not, without caring about how many times you've done it. Now notice that the element's title gets converted to snake case, that is, all the lowercase words with an underscore instead of space. And the @ character that we put has disappeared completely. Now all this happens under the hood, so what you see here is not exactly code written in plain text. And as a matter of fact, the function's argument is now a link to the source element. So if we click it, we teleport to the element it refers to, which is very, very convenient sometimes. One last thing about the visits function: if we are calling the function from inside an element and want to mention the element itself, we can call it without any arguments between parentheses. For example, let's go to the element where we ask the necromancer about the skeleton. So here, what if we want to allow a loop where the player can keep asking about the skeleton and the flow keeps leading back to that same element? Note that the only way to do such a loop from one element to itself is to connect it with a jumper that points to the same element. So we can copy the element and paste it as a jumper, and we can give it a name, a title, so we don't get confused here. So ask about skeleton. And the jumper gets the same title automatically. And now we can connect from the element to itself and add a label that says, "Are you sure the skeleton has no money?" And this creates a loop since we get back to the same reply. So from here, we get the option, "Are you sure the skeleton has no money?" If we choose that option, we go back to this element. Now, if we don't want to keep getting the same response, we have to modify the content based on how many times we have seen this. And to do this, we can use, of course, the visits function. So let's add an ArcScript segment in the element's content. So if this is the first time we visit this element, and as I say, if we don't put any argument between the parentheses of visits, we actually imply this very element, the current element. So if the visits are 1, which means if this is the first time we visit this element, then we'll leave this first response, okay, because it makes sense. Then we can add an else if, and we're going to say else if visits equals 2. So if it's the second time we come here, "Are you sure the skeleton has no money?" you ask. And then we get Solon Blasphemous shrugs. And of course we have to, And of course we have to close the if block with an and if. Oh, before that we can add an else. Otherwise the third time, the fourth time, we get no content. So we need some content for the third time and onwards. And this content can be the response. Sorry, you don't bother asking him again. And then we can close with the end if. So this seems about right. So the first time we visit, we see this first response. The second time, the second time comes from this loop. So we got to be careful here. If there was another route, another flow that would lead back to this, perhaps this response would make no sense. But since our only flow that returns us to this element is through this option, are you sure the skeleton has no money? We can get the response, are you sure the skeleton has no money? And Solon Blasphemous shrugs. And then we get this option. And the third time we come back here, we get you don't bother asking him again. And we finish. So let's test this part. So let's ask Solon Blasphemous, do you have any money? He goes through his pockets. Sorry, he replies. So how about that skeleton of yours? So this is the element with the loop. I see you remembered to bring your skeleton along, though. Carrying a pouch would have been too much. And are you sure the skeleton has no money and anyone else? So this is the one that creates the loop. And we go back to the same element, but with different text. Are you sure the skeleton has no money? He shrugs. And then we can go back again to this same element, but you don't bother asking him again and again and again. So the loop, we can do this loop as many times as we want. And then we can proceed with anyone else. Let me just make a quick correction here. I'm just going to put this in second person. And is there another one like this? I don't think so. I think we're good. So that was all for this episode on using the visits function to check whether and how many times the player has visited parts of our game. If you are finding these tutorials helpful, please consider subscribing to Arcweave's official YouTube channel. You can find us, the Arcweave team, hanging out on our Discord server, and of course you can follow Arcweave on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. I'm Yanis from Arcweave. Thank you for watching, and let the games begin.